Last week, the Federal Reserve met and it put up the Fed funds rate. The European Central Bank met and put up the ECB rate. But this week, the RBA met and didn't put up our rates, which surprised me. But as I thought about it, I thought that for the RBA, something much larger is happening at the moment than monetary policy. We forget that now, from this period for the next 2 months, this is the period of the handover of control of the Reserve Bank of Australia from Mr. Philip Lowe, PhD, to Michelle Bullock. I met Michelle Bullock last year when she presented for us and found that she was a highly competent but very self-effacing person. In my introduction to her, I compared it to people in the Federal Reserve System, such as Mary Daly, who's the president of the San Francisco Fed, and Loretta Mester, who's president of the Cleveland Fed. And Michelle Bullock thought I was winding her up, talking about her in comparison to these illustrious people in the Fed system. But now, a year later, she's the person they'll be looking at international conferences, and she's significantly now more important than them. And that takes a bit of getting used to. We forget that a person serves in the position of governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia for 7 years. The previous incumbent actually served for 7 years plus another 10 years. Glenn Stevens, who of course presented for us a number of times. And so what we've got now, what the RBA has now, is an opportunity provided by the Fed, because the Fed doesn't meet for another 8 weeks and therefore can't do anything. And in that 8 weeks, Michelle Bullock has got to get used to all the reins of control because of the RBA, because on the 20th of September, the Federal Reserve will meet again, and what we believe they will do is increase rates then by another 25 basis points to make the Fed funds rate of 5.6%. And we think that that will be the final increase in the Fed funds rate in the cycle. Now, I'm guessing that the RBA isn't going to change the cash rate between now and its next meeting in October. And in doing so, it puts all of the public emphasis on Michelle Bullock. So Michelle Bullock is then the person in the position, seen as the position of making the calls, having the power, and the person who has to be referred to. And I think it's very likely that she'll increase rates in her first meeting in October to demonstrate that she's that person. But the point is, where do we finally get to? If we look at the history of the Australian cash rate relative to the Fed funds system, or the Fed funds rate, the Australian cash rate came into existence in 1990. So we've got about 30-some years of data to look at it. And I've talked about this before, that twice we've winded up with a higher cash rate than the Fed funds rate, and twice we've ended up with a lower cash rate than the Fed funds rate. And I've noted that on both occasions when we had higher rates than the Fed funds rate, we had a Labor government. But that's not really the important thing analytically in economic terms, because when I go back and look at the data, when we had a higher cash rate than the Fed funds rate was when we had a larger budget deficit in Australia than the US had. And when we had a lower cash rate than their Fed funds rate is when we had a lower budget deficit. Most recently, the most recent example was back in 2019, not that long ago, when Scott Morrison was still Prime Minister. And back then, the Fed funds rate ran up. It was tightened by the Federal Reserve to a level of 2.4%. And the Australian cash rate was unmoved. It was 1.5%, and that meant that on the last occasion in which the Fed peaked, the Australian cash rate was 0.9% lower than the Fed funds rate. And the reason that was happening was because Australia had a budget deficit of 1% of GDP and the US had a budget deficit of 5% of GDP. That's the real thing that's driving this. If we just start with that 0.9% and we say, okay, at the moment we again have a lower budget deficit than the US, okay? So we can quite logically wind up with a cash rate which is lower than the Fed funds rate. I would expect that we'll wind up with about the same amount of difference below the Fed funds rate that we did in 2019. And that difference was 0.9%. Well, if the Australian cash rate is going to be, if the Fed funds rate is going to be 5.6%, 0.9% lower than that is 4.7%. My estimate of where the cash rate peaks is slightly higher than that, and the market consensus is slightly lower than that. But really, there is in fact very little difference between the two. So what I think the RBA is doing now is something more important than thinking about monetary policy. I think what they're actually doing is engaged in a handover between Mr. Philip Lowe, PhD, and Michelle Bullock. Michelle Bullock will be in the job for a very long time, 7 years, and needs to be well equipped when she first faces the media after chairing her first meeting in October, at which I believe she will hike rates. It'll be up to her to decide exactly where cash rates are going to peak. But my guess is that my previous estimate of 495 basis points is pretty close to the mark. But we'll see how it plays out when she's in control. Unfortunately, it's a couple of years until we get Michelle Bullock as a guest here to speak. We have the Deputy Governor next year of the RBA, and we don't know who that is quite yet, but I'm sure that'll be a pretty good presentation as well.